We ate nearly every lunch together, exploring the finest, cheapest eateries we could find. One joint in particular, Henry Chung's Hunan on Montgomery, before it was destroyed by the earthquake, filled our hungry bellies with cold peanut sauce noodles, fiery Henry special, or wok-scorched chow fun. It was glorious eating at its best. And it was over these meals that I came to learn of his love and devotion for Lainey and his mom. Greg, as the man in his family, fretted relentlessly over the health and well-being of these women, and it pained him greatly to be without the resources to make their lives significantly better. While sorrow and frustration had already checkered this young man's past, Greg wasn't bitter or angry. He was instead filled with hope and the belief that hard work would provide a way out. Greg was driven in many respects to assure that his family would never again be shamed by poverty. And as many of you know, few men have ever shown the devotion that Greg showed to these women, an unbridled devotion to their well-being that also came to include Allison, the lightning bolt true love of his life. This is the Greg Reiter that is known to most, if not all of you in this room. The Gregorio that I came to know is another person that artfully hid behind a number of masks, each more elaborate and sophisticated than the previous, and that will likely strike resonance with those of you in this room who are also high achievers and who are afflicted by what psychologists call the imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome can be defined as a collection of feelings of inadequacy that persist even in the face of information that indicates that the opposite is true. It is experienced internally as chronic self-doubt or feelings of intellectual fraud. How many times did we all hear Greg exclaim that he just got lucky, or that his personal success wasn't a big deal? I think his self-deprecating manner was his way of dealing with his view that he didn't deserve his success or professional position, and that sooner or later, his lack of talent would be unmasked. It is for this reason that the biggest smiles that I saw on his face when in a professional setting were often those that he wore when in actual costume, as if in the suspension of reality, there was temporary safety. To best illustrate this point, I'll begin with a simple costume that Greg wore to an Elizabethan Christmas-themed party at our home in Hillsborough. Here's Greg sporting an adult beverage just outside of this enlargement's view that I recall was a Farniente Chardonnay. In attendance were some of the most talented people in fixed income analytics that I believe had ever been assembled outside of Wall Street. Chuck Ramsey and I built Structured Capital Management, a far too short-lived skunk works we buried inside of Alex Brown and Sons when Bear Stearns was still running strong. Our young and relatively inexperienced team included, among others, David Ewan, Mui Song Jo, Samir Noriega, Thomas Spantholz, Birger Nestebi, DJ Tengden, and Greg Reiter. Even then, though they were green, all of these fellows would go on to significant careers in fixed income, in no small part because of the genius of David Ewan and our close collaboration with Frank Vabosi. David is currently Director of Quantitative Strategy and manager of several portfolios at Franklin Resources. Song in the back is VP of Mortgage Structuring at American Capital. Samir became a trader of MBS credit at Smith Barney and JP Morgan. Tommaso became co-head of active fixed income at Barclays. And Greg, as you know, after many engagements with top firms, ended up as an MD of residential MBS research at Wells Fargo. Costumes were just part of our culture, and it was embraced with gusto. And as a tribute to Greg, I'm going to complete the rest of my talk in gear representative of that we often found ourselves in. You see, every one of the fellows on our team was first generation, quantitatively bent, and without the pedigree that would otherwise have found a place on the Tony side of corporate finance, where social equity and class standing play a strong but unspoken role in one's selection. We built a highly specialized boutique that reverse engineered the complex structures being used on the street to create liquidity in the conventional mortgage lending market, and we developed specialized tools and novel structures that we applied to other asset classes, such as lottery receivables, seller carryback mortgages, and Danish assets, all of the time working below the radar screen of the big houses on the street. Because of our specialized work, we didn't house our efforts in the Alex Brown white shoe button-down offices in San Francisco, but rather in a Birkenstock playroom on the water's edge in Burlingame. To do this work, we had to think differently than our compatriots in New York, to use cutting-edge software tools and methods that we developed, and to produce our own research. But in doing so, we adopted some unconventional behaviors. As fixed-income renegades, quasi-misfits, and putative outcasts from the Oxford button-down and regimental cravat brigades, the team often sported flip-flops, cargo shorts, Hawaiian shirts, and beanies with propellers on their heads. Greg was particularly fond of beanies with propellers on their heads. We orchestrated happy dances that took us bounding through our offices to commemorate great trades or landmark placements. And to celebrate, we routinely ate a small village's worth of spicy burritos. Our only limiter was that we not dream too small. As Pablo Coelho alludes in The Alchemist, one's true regret should not be in failing to achieve one's big dreams, but rather that fear might have so constrained our dreams that we dream too small and easily achieve the mark. Fear not to dream big. We were all big dreamers, remained big dreamers, and continue to reach beyond our grasp. Those early years, quite frankly, were some of the happiest periods in my life, and I pray that somewhere, somehow, Gregorio's again dancing such happy dances, and engorging on the juiciest burritos in heaven. We will miss you, my friend. We will miss your joyful mirth and your unbridled care for the weak and defenseless. We lament that you left us too soon, and weep in sorrow of the vacuum you've left in our hearts. We are better for having enjoyed your laughter, and stronger because you showed us that a life with love is a life well lived. Dance free, querido amigo. Free of the masks, free of earthly responsibilities, and free in the knowledge that you left the world a better place for your having been here. I miss you, my friend.
Thank you, Allison, for giving me the opportunity to speak. And as you might have noticed, I'm not on the program. I knew Greg during his San Francisco years, his later San Francisco years, when he worked at Schwab. I worked with him in the late 90s until he left for Freddie Mac in 2002. And I was there as Chief Investment Officer of Charles Schwab Investment Management, and Greg was Senior Analyst on asset backs, which had become especially important to us as we grew in complexity and lacked the depth in that area. So he was a brilliant hire to get us on our feet in that side of things. I think working with Greg, the outstanding thing about him as a professional colleague was his quickness, his insight into things, and his ability to simplify them, understand them, and bring all that together very, very quickly. But on the personal side, stood out to me about Greg, and has always stood out, and it's one of the people I've thought about many, many times since I worked with him, is his warmth. He's a very warm person, very funny, very easy to work with, and more than willing to share the burdens of any team he was working with, to do more than most people would ever contribute. And that humor was incredibly important in so many situations. Working in finance and working in a trading room situation or working around people who trade, you know some of the intemperate remarks that people can make and so on. That was never Greg's way, and he was always always kept a very different tone about things, and people always enjoyed working with him. He was someone you wanted to work with. I think that as we got into the areas that we were working with, and I hear the stories from his high school friend about rocketry, and the goal was blowing things up. I think that helped him in his later career because we always said, well, it's not rocket science, it's asset backs. But the goal was different. We tried to have things not blow up, and he was very good at keeping us out of trouble there. I think that the outstanding time that I think of working with Greg was in 1998 during the Asian crisis. And people know now, of course, about Lehman Brothers going bankrupt in 2008. But they probably aren't aware that Lehman was extremely distressed in 1998 during the Asian crisis. They had a number of different exposures, and there were many rumors about them. And we at Schwab had Lehman paper in our portfolios, and as we, partly through other points of view, corporate side, but on the asset-backed side, we became aware of Lehman's issues, and so we began to work closely with them to try to see what we could do to protect ourselves. And it became very clear that within Lehman there were cross-currents about how to do this and resistance to certain ideas. But we got Greg involved, and one of the ideas we came up with was to get collateral behind our note to them. This was an unusual thing because in this part of the market it wasn't normal to have collateral. But as we worked with them and they began to see the advantages that the note wouldn't be called away, more and more people got involved, and the pressure was enormous. One of the few documents I have from that time refers to it as the events leading up to September 11th. That was a key date. But it was September 11th, 1998. But that was our crisis date in that environment. And Greg was central to all of this, keeping it all going, keeping it together. There were, I counted 24 people involved, and it was an incredible burden to keep that pressure at bay. And when it was all done, and the final terms were coming together, I was surprised by how much we had gotten, how well he had negotiated the whole thing. I said, well, how much of the collateral that we were talking about did we get? And he said, well, all of it. So that was a surprise. He had clearly done very well there. And we got a better rate. So we ended up better in every way. Part of the problem at Lehman was that they had their own resistance, as I said, internally. So there were great struggles there. So when it was all said and done, Lehman held a dinner celebrating amongst themselves, but we were all invited. And one of the heroes of that dinner was Greg, because he had been central to getting this together from our side. At that dinner, they gave out medals for the conflict we had been through, and they read out about the heroes and their struggles. So I told Allison, if you happen to find this in one of his boxes somewhere, this is his hero medal from saving Lehman the first time around. We can only wonder what would have happened if he'd been there the second time around. Things might have been different. I hadn't kept up with Greg. I know in the world of Facebook and email, it may seem possible to keep up more with people, but I think that I think of it as centrifugal force, that as our lives gain speed and we orbit wider and wider, we're pulled away from each other. And you think of the people that you've known through the years, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, and you think, well, where are they now? And how could I stay in touch with them? How would I find them? And it especially saddened me when I learned about Greg's death that it turned out I had moved back to Virginia in 2007, and he had been here in Middleburg for several years now. So we were neighbors, and I didn't even know it. He only lived 10 miles away. So I especially am sad that I missed the opportunity to re-engage with him. So I think that I do believe that there will come a time when I am able to speak to Greg again. And when I think of all the people I've worked with through the years and the friends I've had, Greg definitely stands out. He's one of the good ones. So thank you.
I'm Mark Hanson, and I had the pleasure of knowing Greg and Allison for about the last 20 years. But I think two things are starting to emerge in these great remarks and reminiscences. Whether you knew Greg as a teenager or as a 50-year-old, he was the same guy, right? Everything that you're describing, I can imagine from Greg later in his life. The other thing that's striking me now, and even though it sounds like we share the same speechwriter, we don't. We're all just meeting each other for the first time, but it strikes me that, Greg did a lot of job hopping, if you will. But I used to think it was his issue. It's our issue. This was like a high-stakes game of go fish. As soon as you lose a card of value, you can't wait to get it back in your hand. And each one of us tried to hire Greg how many times? 2, 3, 4 times over the course of his career? It was never ending. And we all had near misses, and next time we'll make this happen. We all shared the same experience. So I have a few prepared remarks, but I think that what's so endearing about this moment is it all just so deeply resonates with us. We all knew Greg for the person he was and how he treated people. And so I'll begin with this. I've never known somebody like Greg Reiter. In fact, I'm not sure any combination of my friends could even approximate what Greg was. When I think of him, there's this rush of qualities. Many have been mentioned. He was compassionate, above all, compassionate. He was intelligent. His energy was off the charts. His allergies were off the charts. He was curious. He was enthusiastic, selfless, funny, driven, all these things that you would hope for in people that you surround your life with. When I first met Greg, we worked at Freddie Mac together, but I didn't really know him. And we had some kind of Wall Street dinner. Somebody had made a lot of money doing something. I forget what it was. And there were about a dozen of us that went out to eat in Virginia. And I'm not sure why, but I knew that night I wanted to get to know who Greg was. I don't recall the circumstances, but after that dinner, I knew I had to offer Greg a job, or he had to offer me one. But one way or another, we had to work together, and it served as the telling dynamic for the next 20 years. And it sounds like it's a very shared experience. I just wanted to be with Greg, to learn from him, to share with him, to laugh, be inspired by him. Now, I'm not telling anybody anything they don't know. Greg made his presence felt in a way that is so unique. There's no hiding who he was. I think corporate life, and it was alluded to earlier, is flawed in so many ways. But one thing that it does for me is it helps me see how people treat people. And do they show a different side of themselves to one part of the org chart than the other? That wasn't Greg at all. In that regard, his character and values were never more clear. His generosity of time and talents, his compassion, he lavished in every direction. Just trying to get through an airport with Greg was hard because there's always somebody he just met who he could help. Whether she was struggling with the tickets or there's somebody that had just spilled something in the hallway, his compassion was overflowing. He also taught us, I think, about living life your way, his way. While he never dwelled too long in any one job, each transition was purposeful and often the result of something that was motivating him beyond work. His latest endeavor with Allison, I think, is one of the best examples of this. Their commitment to the farm, the sanctuary, is a calling. It's a testament to their shared beliefs and their values. Greg wouldn't let a job disrupt that. His commitment to his mom and his sister were also front and center in his life. His concern and caring were frequent topics for us. No matter what was going on in Greg's life, he never lost perspective of that goal and those responsibilities. Over the years, Greg and I shared a lot of road trips. We visited investors throughout the country and into Asia. It's a bit sad that for all the traveling we did, we were probably two of the worst travelers I've ever known. Between air sickness, nausea, plugged ears, Greg and I saw ourselves with all of our defenses down. And it was the same Greg. The same Greg that was filling up the airbag was the guy you saw when he got promoted or recognized. He was just Greg. He had no pretenses, ever. I started asking people around the office the other day, I said, so what's your favorite memory of Greg? And a little bit surprising to me was something that they remember most was his salty humor for some of those in the room. I think it wasn't for all of them because Greg knew his audience really well. And for those that appreciated it, he could play with the best of them. Whether it was turning off your office lights, flipping you off, telling you were terrible things, you couldn't help but burst out in laughter and just love his just uncontrolled joy in those moments. And you shared with them. He never ceased to amaze me. He was beyond entertaining. I think he was enthralling. He captured our attention and our hearts all at the same time. So my heart goes out to Allison and to all of us here today. I really struggle with the events, particularly the accident and it all. He gave us so much and he had so much more to give. But what gives me some solace is this kooky vacation I took my family on a couple years ago. And we were in Mexico and trying to understand more of the Mayan culture and the rest. And there are all these gift shops throughout with skulls decorated in all sorts of different ways. Beautiful. So I asked one of the artists, I said, so what's the fascination with death and skulls and art? And he described moments later kind of his own belief about life, which I found very, very useful in times like this. And for him, he said something that beings as we know them have two passings from this world. First, they separate from their physical selves. We celebrate, we come together in those moments. He said, but the more important passing in life is how long are you remembered? How long does that person stay with you? Greg is off the charts, going to have longevity in that regard. For me, I won't forget Greg or the time we shared. I doubt you will either. With each memory, I'll feel the same warmth, the same smile that he produced in every one of us. Long live Greg's memory with each and every one of you. Thank you.
This is the first time I've spoken at a memorial service for a dear friend, and Greg was a wonderful person and a dear friend. Allison, thank you very much for the opportunity. Greg and I first became friendly when I hired him in early 2005 to join the mortgage strategy group at UBS. I didn't know Greg very well at all, and I felt a little bit guilty hiring him away from Mark Hanson at Freddie Mac, who is also a friend. Mark's reaction: you could do more for him at this point than I. I care a lot about him, and I want the best for him. I was really impressed both by Mark's kindness and by the fact that Greg had made that kind of impression on a former boss. I've been in Mark's shoes numerous times, and I can't say I've ever been quite that graceful. Greg was smart, but so was everyone else in the mortgage strategy group at UBS. What really distinguished Greg was his very high emotional IQ and his kindness. He knew when he could be really helpful to others, and he did way more than his fair share of things for the group that just needed to get done, and he was also instrumental in bringing along a generation of young analysts. We always stayed very late on Tuesday evenings to put out our weekly Mortgage Strategist publication, and I mean very late, oftentimes finishing at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., technically Wednesday morning, sometimes later. But we were never hungry, even Greg. The highlight of the evening was dinner ordered in from a local restaurant about 7 p.m. We all worked hard on the publication, sat down to dinner, and then wrote some more. Whenever anyone finished their article and it had been edited and laid out, they were free to leave. Greg was always the person who pitched in when others were running behind schedule, even knowing that it would keep him there later on already late nights. He was the person who came over to me on Mondays and again on Tuesdays when his article was running reasonably well and asked how I was doing, Did I need help on my article? He was usually the guy that told me when others were in trouble and offering to help. And late Tuesday night, he was always the guy offering to proofread other people's work. And somehow Greg's offers perfectly coincided with when we really needed the help the most. He just had a tremendously high emotional IQ. And he was also the person who often volunteered to take these curveball articles. We had a weekly meeting when we discussed what should go into the publication. When something new came up, members of the group volunteered to cover it. Greg, who covered agency MBS, especially specified pools and agency CMOs, was a frequent volunteer. I remember clearly when the asset-backed commercial paper conduits began to run into trouble in August of 2007, and we had a discussion in the meeting that it was a potentially very big issue. Okay, I asked, who knows a lot about asset-backed commercial paper conduits and wants to look at this? No hands. Okay, who knows something about asset-backed commercial paper conduits and is willing to take a look at it? Greg's hand went up. I worked on related issues at Schwab. I'll handle it. And he, with Gina Curro's very able assistance, did a wonderful job on the first article in under a week. Asset-backed commercial paper conduit deleveraging creates disarray and opportunities. And although I think that was about an 80-hour week, he then became the expert on the